Additional photos from the FEMA report are here. It was reported that a 1-inch steel column had been reduced to 1/2-inch thickness. Its edges, curled like a paper scroll, have been thinned to almost razor sharpness. Gaping holes let light shine through a formerly solid steel flange. And the Swiss cheese appearance shocked all the Firewise professors who expected to see distortion and bending, but not holes. The detailed study recommended by these Firewise professors in FEMA never got done, and NIST never mentioned any of this mystery in its final report. And although this presentation will not go into detail on it, independent scientists have proposed answers through a series of peer-reviewed scientific articles which you can find online. The NIST investigation began just after the publication of the FEMA World Trade Center report in May 2002. The investigation proceeded for 2 years until 2004, when NIST decided to decouple its report on Building 7 from its investigation into the towers. In any case, we can say that the NIST investigation into Building 7 proceeded for at least 5 years, from 2002 to 2004, and then from 2005 to 2008. This is despite NIST's claim that its investigation lasted for only those final 3 years. At some point during the 6-year period between NIST's charter and its final report on Building 7, the objective seemed to change. Originally, the specific objective of the NIST investigation for Building 7 was to explain why and how Building 7 collapsed. Then later, NIST said the challenge was to determine if a fire-induced floor system failure could occur in Building 7 under an ordinary building contents fire. Now, this suggests that NIST started with assumptions and that they were going to try to prove a fire-based theory, regardless of what they found. By December 2003, investigators had obtained a great deal of information on the building. And their report said that hypotheses have been postulated for the collapse of the building. NIST is analyzing these and other possible structural collapse sequences as part of its investigation. Detailed mappings for the fires and so forth are underway for Building 7. And as I said, NIST had also started gathering thousands of photos and videos, which they effectively kept away from the public. In June 2004, NIST published an interim report on Building 7, and they presented what they called a working hypothesis. It was basically the diesel fuel fire idea, the truss girders in floors 5 through 7, if it holds up upon further analysis. NIST might have wanted to gloss over its first 2 years of investigation into Building 7 because it did not want to acknowledge some of the things, ultimately, in its 2004 interim report that contradicted its final report. At the time of the 2004 interim report, NIST was still looking at many different hypotheses. None of these hypotheses, or any of NIST's earlier reports, had much to do with the final theory, and none of them had anything to do with explosives. Shocking admission was made 2 years after the 2004 interim report by NIST lead investigator Shyam Sunder, who made it clear that they had little or no idea what happened to Building 7 at that time. This is very startling in the fact that, and by 2006, construction had been completed on a new Building 7 that was placed in the exact same location. It was 52 stories tall. It took 4 years to complete, and we still didn't know what happened to the first one. But this was 4 years after NIST began its investigation. So again, as Professor Graham pointed out, we should wonder how anyone could have predicted this building would collapse, given that 4 years into the investigation, government scientists had no idea how it happened. But NIST suddenly told us in 2008 that it was all obvious and that science was behind it. We're going to take a close look at NIST's final theory and discover for ourselves whether or not it's obvious. NIST final reports for Building 7 came out in 2008. These were NIST NC Star 1A, the final report, and NIST NC Star 19, the supportive documentation, larger reports behind that. These can be found online at wtc.nist.gov, and they are about 900 pages in total. So please do look at them. They're not quite as large as the report for the towers. But here's the gist of the overall theory that NIST proposed. Fire-induced thermal expansion of the floor system surrounding column 79 led to the collapse of floor 13, which triggered a cascade of floor failures. In this case, the floor beams on the east side, actually on the northeast corner of the building, expanded enough that they pushed the girder spanning between columns 79 and 44 to the west on the 13th floor. This movement was enough for the girder to walk off its support at column 79. The lower left diagram is kind of a depiction of what they're trying to say there, and how NIST envisions the girder being pushed by a beam. And the result was that the unsupported girder and other local fire-induced damage caused floor 13 to collapse, beginning a cascade of floor failures down to the 5th floor. I'm not going to actually talk about that. We'll leave that to Tony. But the diagram on the lower right is a depiction of that, with the column, the critical column, being left unsupported and then buckling. So one thing we might begin with is, since NIST collapse initiation sequence begins with thermal expansion, and to be more specific, linear thermal expansion of the floor beams, we must ask, is thermal expansion a new phenomenon, as NIST has implied? The answer is absolutely not. Thermal expansion is well known, and its effects on building components have been tested. One well-known series of tests occurred in the UK at the Cardington Fire Test Facility. Tests done at Cardington under severe fire conditions showed that floor beams will deflect downward in response to thermal expansion. This is particularly true because the floor beams are made composite with the floor assemblies, as we'll discuss. This means that shear studs are used to attach the beams to the floors and make them one piece. Without the studs, the beams could also deflect laterally or sideways to relieve the stress of expansion. So what does NIST say happened in Building 7? Here's a photo of the area showing the critical column, column 79. NIST says fires on floor 12 heated the ceiling that included the floor beams for floor 13, causing thermal expansion of the beams, which pushed the girder at column 79 off its seat. And from there, everything just fell apart. You can see the girder here with its seat and the floor beams that are connected to it. Here's another diagram from the NIST report that shows NIST's view of how the floor beams on the northeast side of the building, shown here as purple lines, pushed against the critical girder. The girder connected column 79 to the external wall at column 44. The girder to column connection is blown up in the inset diagram, showing how NIST envisions that the girder was pushed off its seat. We can see the holes for the bolts in the seat, but what we can't see is that there were 2 bolts in the lower seat connection and 2 bolts in the upper clip connection, making 4 bolts at the column girder connection. On the bottom here, you can see the pictures that NIST used in its media presentation, Shyam Sundar, when it unveiled its final report. The picture is reversed with respect to the diagram above, but you can see the general idea. NIST told us in 2004 about shear studs that connected the beams and the girders to the floor assemblies above them. This is how the beams and the girders are made composite with the floors. You can see in the diagram here how the studs connected the floors to the beams or girders. The NIST interim report said that most of the beams and girders were made composite with the slabs using shear studs. The exception, they pointed out, was a lack of drawing notes for core girders, and the girder in question is not a core girder, meaning it was not within the core section of